Peter, it's really good to see you, and welcome back to New Mexico in Focus.
I'm always happy to be here. Thank you.
So I want to talk about the issue of people living outside, and I'd like to do that through the lens of rights and interests. And I'd like to start with a really basic question. Do you have to have a street address for the Constitution to apply to you?
No, of course not. Many people in America don't have street addresses. The calculation that we hear these days of less than 1 million is vastly off, and so all of those people are Americans if they're here.
Okay, so when we talk about the issue of homelessness, who else has rights in that conversation, and what are they?
Well, that's a great question I hadn't anticipated. People who live in Albuquerque all have rights. And the city of Albuquerque actually has rights. But what is clear to me after you and I talked on the phone is that people are using that word to characterize what is in fact an interest and not a right.
What is the difference, Peter, between a right and an interest?
Well, my neighbor has an interest in my keeping my lawn tidy and in my not being such an outlandish neighbor that it's hard for him to sell his house. But he doesn't have any right to tell me how to live or how to keep my lawn. And so that is the controversy that seems to me so peculiar, is that we talk about people and neighborhood associations as having the right to not have the unpleasantness of having poor people nearby. And that's just false. It's not a right.
So one of the things I'm particularly interested in, it seems to me that there are a couple of systems that are responsible for balancing the kinds of interests that you just talked about. And I'd like to start on the policy side. What obligation do policymakers, be they mayors, city councilors, governors, what obligation do they have to balance the interests, say, of a neighbor, a business owner, and a person who is living unsheltered?
Well, as a matter of law, they have an obligation to not affirmatively cause harm. But here in a common law country, unlike a civil law country like France, the government doesn't owe anything to anybody except don't harm them. And so here we are in Albuquerque where there is a lawsuit going on about the rights of people who are unhoused to exist. And that's a framework that other courts have said you have a right to not be treated cruelly and unusually, and when you're performing the essential function of sleeping, which is the only way you can stay alive, you have to be allowed to have a place to do the essential function. That's a right, and to deny you a place to sleep is cruel and unusual. And so that's the framework of these lawsuits that we've been seeing, and the one that Grant's past case is about. That right.
And I want to get to the Eighth Amendment in just a minute and the cruel and unusual punishment clause. One other thing I've been thinking about since we chatted on the phone the other day, I think people often think of, back to the interests we're talking about, they think of the interests of a business owner as somehow in competition with the interests or the rights of a person who is unhoused to exist. Do these have to be competing interests? Do we have to look at it that way?
Well, I don't look at it that way. And in these last couple of years, as I've been doing a lot of work with people who are unhoused, in the last several months, have started to reach out to business owners and leaders of business associations to talk about where their interests are the same as people who are unhoused. So business owners do not want people sleeping on their doorstep, interfering with people coming in and out of the business. And yet, what's currently going on in our town is when people find a place that's out of the way and they do a camping arrangement, which is either small or large, and they stay out of the flow of traffic and they have a place. Right now, the government, the city administration, is chasing those people out of there, oftentimes stealing their stuff and destroying it, and then forcing them into alleyways and other kinds of places that they would rather not be. the business owners have that same interest, right? Let's have these people who don't have a roof stay in places that are out of the way, relatively contained, and not bothering anybody. And so I have found that there are business owners who now see that having a place for people who can't afford a roof and don't have one ought to be allowed to stay. Those are common interests.
I'm curious too, you've been doing this work for a very long time, obviously, and things don't always work the way they should. But in practice, in effect, ultimately, based on the policies that we see from the city of Albuquerque and elsewhere, whose interests end up trumping whose?
Well, it's quite obvious that our mayor decided sometime in 2022 that he was going to get tough on people who are unhoused. And he held that speech at Coronado Park where he started to say that crime and being unhoused are equivalent. And he started to equate being without a place to live with being a criminal. And since that time, he and the police chief have been hammering the unhoused. We've seen in a recent publication that the police chief said in writing to our mayor, let's hammer the unhoused, and he's still the police chief. Now, if he said, let's hammer the poor, or let's hammer the people who have a lot of melanin in their skin, what would a proper mayor do?
I think that is a fair question, and also you and I have both been around long enough to know that this isn't the first city administration that's taken this approach. We've seen this in the past. I'll never forget a lawsuit that had to do with the 4th Street Mall, and text messages were uncovered there, where then Public Safety Director Darren White had told the police that they could take the handcuffs off. So this is a kind of an old narrative that we've seen here. I want to pivot just a little bit to the Constitution. One of the knocks on the Constitution is that it disfavors the public good in furtherance of individual rights and liberties. Does that resonate in the context of the conversation we're having around homelessness?
No, actually, the people who I've done these listening sessions among people who are unhoused for about 2 years now. And I've met hundreds of people who are sleeping outdoors because they don't have a roof. And those people are not what the demonizers accuse them of being, by and large. There are, in fact, people who are predatory and generally exploit others who are unhoused, as opposed to people who are privileged. But among that population, what I have found is that I've met people who were bank clerks, educators, people who aged out of the child welfare system when they turned 18, who are every bit as normal, typical, good as any other person in this community. And yet they're not being treated that way, and they're being treated as if they are criminals. And that's the thing that's wrong with the rhetoric of this whole conversation. Those people have the right to not be harmed by the government, and that's the substantive due process right, what's called the danger creation theory. The government is prohibited by the United States Constitution from causing harm to those people, just as they are me and you and the mayor. And so that is the conversation that I hope that we can have among people here in Albuquerque is, can we just stop harming people who are the same as you and me and are not criminals? Because it seems to me that people have gotten away with equating being poor with being a criminal, and I'm sick of it.
Peter, let's talk about the other system that maybe creates a potential avenue to address this, and that's the courts. You mentioned Johnson versus Grants Pass, which is a case out of Oregon. The justices heard oral arguments last week. Aside from kind of the cruel and unusual punishment piece of that, what is at the heart of that case, and how could it impact what's happening in New Mexico?
Well, by and large, what those Supreme Court justices focused on was that decision out of the Ninth Circuit, which is based on the cruel and unusual punishment clause. But they also did talk about the substantive due process rights and what it is that people who are unable to care for themselves are entitled to under the Constitution. And I think it was Amy Barrett who was talking about the substantive due process rights of people who are unhoused. But she actually shot herself down and stopped talking about it because she said that's not what Grants Pass is about. And that's what the Albuquerque case is about. Friends of mine who are bringing that case have brought the cruel and unusual punishment claim, but they've also brought the claim under the substantive due process rights under our state constitution. And our state constitution is not necessarily bound by just the parameters of the federal constitution. And so it'll be interesting to see how that case unfolds.
My last question, I've got a minute or two left here. I want to just ask sort of the big open-lensed question of, from your perspective at least, what role should the courts have in addressing this issue that we are all living with and experiencing with folks who live outside?
Well, thanks for asking that. In my years of doing lawsuits for people who are being harmed by the government, I have often seen courts as the last resort. And when you're going to court to try and address those issues, it's usually because the people who you're trying to help are disfavored and they don't have money and they don't have power and they don't have much influence with elected politicians. And so I do continue to think of courts as the last method that anybody should use, but the only method that's available when people are disfavored. And so I do hope that the politicians in Albuquerque will turn the conversation to how can we balance the interests of people who are poor with the balance of business owners and others. And that's what I'm thinking the City Council is going to do.
Peter, thank you so much for the thoughtful conversation. I appreciate it as always.
Happy to be here. Thanks.